Why was Rome afraid of barbarians? You will be shocked when you learn the truth. The eternal city, the center of civilization, the ruler of the world. The Roman Empire seemed an indestructible force, built on a foundation of stone, laws, and invincible legions. But on the outskirts of this shining world, in the shadows of dark forests and endless steppes, lived a force whose very name struck primitive terror into the hearts of the Romans, the barbarians. The Gauls, Goths, Huns, and dozens of other tribes brought chaos with them, challenging the very existence of the empire. However, the real fear did not come only from the glint of foreign steel. It lurked in the very heart of Rome, in its weakening arteries and cracks in the marble facade. Internal diseases made the colossus vulnerable to external blows. Watch the video to the end to find out how arrogance turned into panic, why Rome's greatest fear was of its own making, and which internal enemy proved more terrifying than any barbarian chieftain. What if I told you that everything you believed about savage barbarians was a lie? The image of the ferocious and uncivilized savage was largely created by the Romans themselves. It was the most powerful information campaign of the ancient world, pursuing very specific goals. Imagine an empire that had to constantly justify its wars of conquest to its own citizens and allies. If you were a Roman senator promoting another costly military campaign, you would understand the need to create a narrative in which the enemy was presented not simply as a neighbor with a different culture, but as a threat to civilization itself. Propaganda was not a 20th century invention. The Romans were masters of it. It was important for Roman society to have a clear division between us and them. We were citizens, bearers of culture, law, and order. They were everyone else, the chaotic and dangerous world beyond the borders of civilization. Roman historians such as Tacitus describe barbarian tribes with both contempt and secret admiration. They emphasize their physical strength, ferocity in battle, and love of freedom. This created an image of a worthy but savage enemy, the defeat of which made Rome even greater. Politicians and military leaders needed this image to justify constant warfare. The conquest of new lands was presented not as an act of aggression, but as a civilizing mission. The legions brought not destruction, but the light of enlightenment to savage peoples. However, it is necessary to make some important clarifications here. Rome's attitude toward the barbarians was more complex than a simple propaganda scheme. Tacitus in Germania does indeed describe the Germans with ambivalence, but his text is also a critique of Roman society itself through contrast with the noble savages. He praises their simplicity, military honor, and moral purity, contrasting them with decadent Rome. Moreover, the Romans actively interacted with the barbarian peoples, not only through military means. They traded, formed alliances, accepted barbarians into military service, and naturalized them as citizens. By the end of the empire, many senior military commanders and even emperors were of barbarian origin. Propaganda also worked within the country. The threat from the barbarians helped to unite society, especially during periods of internal crisis. The external enemy forced people to forget their differences and unite around the emperor. This image permeated all spheres of life. Triumphal arches depicted conquered barbarian leaders in chains. Gladiatorial combats were staged in the Colosseum, imitating battles with the Germans or Dacians. Over time, the Romans themselves began to believe in the myth they had created. They were accustomed to seeing only an irrational threat in any people beyond the Rhine and Danube. This arrogance prevented them from understanding the true motives and strengths of their neighbors. Visual propaganda was indeed a powerful tool. Trajan's column, Constantine's arch, and other monuments depicted barbarians in humiliating poses of submission. This shaped public perception. However, the claim that the Romans began to believe in the myth they had created and stopped analyzing their opponents is an oversimplification. Roman military intelligence was highly effective. They had a thorough understanding of the tribal structure, politics, and military tactics of their opponents. Caesar, in his Commentaries on the Gallic War, demonstrates a detailed knowledge of the Celtic tribes. The Romans systematically used diplomacy, bribery, and incitement of civil strife among the barbarians. Rome stopped analyzing its enemies, seeing them only as a faceless mass. They did not notice how the barbarian tribes were changing, adopting their own technologies and creating complex political alliances. The fear factory worked so well that it blinded its creators. The Romans feared not so much the real Germans or Sarmatians as their own creation, the ideal barbarian from propaganda texts. And when the real tribes, driven to despair by Rome's own policies, came to its borders, the fear became real. The monster they had created knocked on the gates. This is a poetic metaphor, but historically inaccurate. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the result of the Romans believing their own propaganda and ceasing to understand the barbarians. The reasons were multifactorial: economic crisis, excessive taxation, political instability, overstretched military resources, climate change, and yes, the pressure of migration. The barbarian invasions of the 5th century were the result of a chain reaction that began with the invasion of the Huns, who drove the Goths, Alans, and other peoples from their territories. These tribes sought refuge in the empire not out of a desire to destroy it, but out of desperation. Many barbarian leaders wanted to integrate into the Roman system, obtain land and titles. Do you think this propaganda was a brilliant political move or a fatal mistake that ultimately destroyed the empire? Are you ready to learn the truth about Rome's first great fear? Long before the Goths and Huns, there was a name that made the hearts of Romans tremble: the Gauls. It was they who inflicted a psychological trauma on Rome that lasted throughout its history. Imagine a young state just beginning its journey to greatness, suddenly faced with utter humiliation on its own soil. If you were a Roman who had survived the sacking of your city by barbarians, that experience would shape your worldview for the rest of your life. The trauma of defeat was passed down from generation to generation, shaping the politics and psychology of an entire civilization. In 390 BC, the Gallic army, led by Chief Brennus, approached Rome, which was not yet great but already ambitious. The Roman legions went out to meet them, confident in their superiority, but the Battle of Allia turned out to be a disaster for them. The Gauls did not adhere to the strict formations relied upon by the Romans. Their tactic consisted of a single crushing and furious attack. The deafening battle cries and the sight of tall, fierce warriors broke the fighting spirit of the Romans even before the battle began. The legions were defeated and fled in panic. The way to Rome was open, and the Gauls entered the defenseless city. This event came as a real shock to the Romans, shattering their entire world order. The date of this event is debatable. The traditional date is 390 BC, according to Varro's chronology, but some historians suggest 387 or 3x. The very fact of the sack of Rome by the Gauls is confirmed by many sources, although the details are shrouded in legend. The Gauls did indeed use a tactic of massive attack. Their long swords, tall stature, and battle cry created a terrifying effect. The Roman phalanx of the 4th century BC was still primitive compared to later legions and proved ineffective against the Gallic onslaught. Most of the city was looted. Only a small group of defenders took refuge on Capitoline Hill, the last stronghold of resistance. This moment of humiliation was forever etched in the collective memory of the Roman people. The story of how Brennus threw his sword onto the scales with the ransom money, saying, "Woe to the vanquished," became legendary. It symbolized not just military defeat, but total humiliation. Rome was brought to its knees and forced to pay for its freedom. The famous phrase, "Vae victis," "Woe to the vanquished," became a catchphrase symbolizing the ruthlessness of war. However, the accuracy of this story is questionable. Livy and other Roman historians wrote about events that took place centuries before them, relying on oral tradition mixed with patriotic mythology. There is even an alternative version in which the Roman commander Camillus arrives with his army and drives the Gauls away until they pay a ransom, saying, "Rome is saved not by gold, but by iron." This version was probably created to soften the national humiliation. After the Gauls left, the Romans rebuilt the city and surrounded it with a powerful wall. But the walls could not protect them from fear. This fear, known as metus Gallicus, or Gallic terror, became a constant factor in Roman politics. Any threat from the north, any movement of tribes beyond the Alps caused panic in Rome. It was this fear that largely motivated Caesar's conquests in Gaul. He had to not only conquer new lands, but also destroy the source of centuries-old terror. The Servian Wall, built after the Gallic invasion, was indeed a powerful fortification. The term metus Gallicus was used by Roman authors to describe the panic-stricken fear of the Gauls. However, the connection between the Gallic invasion of the 4th century BC and Caesar's campaign in 5850 BC, 3.5 centuries later, is an oversimplification. Caesar's campaigns were motivated by a variety of factors: his personal ambitions, the need for military glory for his political career, real threats from the migration of the Helvetii and Germanic tribes, and economic interests. Even centuries later, during the late Empire, the memory of the sack of Rome by the Gauls was still alive. This ancient scar constantly reminded the seemingly indestructible empire of its vulnerability. It proved that the eternal city was not eternal. The Gauls were the first to show Rome that its walls could be breached and its legions put to flight. They sowed seeds of fear that sprouted centuries later when new, even more formidable enemies approached the borders. The memory of the Gallic invasion was indeed preserved in Roman culture. Livy, who wrote during the reign of Augustus, describes these events in detail. However, by the late Empire, the Gauls had long been Romanized, and Gaul was one of the most prosperous provinces. The real threats of the 5th century AD came from completely different peoples: the Goths, Vandals, and Huns. The interpretation that the Gallic invasion sowed the seeds of fear that sprouted centuries later is poetic but historically questionable. The fall of the Western Roman Empire cannot be explained by psychological trauma suffered 8 centuries earlier. But what if I told you that the most dangerous enemy was already within the Roman legions? Read on to the next chapter to learn the main secret of the Roman army. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman army. Beginning in the 3rd century, Rome faced an acute shortage of soldiers. Constant wars on several fronts and internal unrest meant that citizens were increasingly reluctant to serve in the legions. Imagine an empire with borders stretching for thousands of kilometers, attacked simultaneously from several directions, where the population is declining due to epidemics and the economy cannot provide enough recruits. If you were a Roman emperor in the 4th century, you would face an impossible dilemma. Either allow the borders to collapse or hire the very people against whom those borders were meant to protect. The empire found what it thought was a brilliant way out of this situation. It began to massively recruit those with whom it had previously fought, the barbarians. Franks, Goths, and Germans became part of the Roman military machine. At first, this seemed like a mutually beneficial solution. Rome gained experience and resilient warriors who were accustomed to harsh conditions. The barbarians received pay, food, and the opportunity to pursue a career in the service of the empire. These warriors, known as federates, often served as entire tribal units under the command of their own chiefs. They retained their weapons, tactics, and customs. In essence, it was a foreign army fighting under Roman banners. However, the terminology needs to be clarified. Federates originally meant allied tribes outside the empire who received subsidies and undertook to provide troops. In the late empire, the term evolved to refer to barbarian military units within the Roman army. It is important to understand that the practice of hiring barbarians was not new in the 3rd century. Rome had been using barbarian auxiliary troops since the time of the Republic. What changed was the scale, the degree of integration, and the decline in the proportion of ethnic Romans in the army. At first, the system worked. The Federate troops successfully defended the borders from raids by their own tribesmen. Rome used barbarians to fight other barbarians, saving the lives of its own citizens. However, over time, the negative consequences became apparent. The loyalty of these troops was questionable. They were loyal not to the idea of Rome, but to their commander and the timely payment of their wages. Moreover, while serving in the Roman army, the barbarians thoroughly studied its strengths and weaknesses. They adopted Roman tactics, discipline, and engineering skills. Rome itself trained its future enemies. This is a common interpretation, but it simplifies reality. Many barbarian warriors were extremely loyal to Rome. They integrated into Roman society, converted to Christianity, married Roman women, and their children became full-fledged Romans. The problem of loyalty was not ethnic, but structural. When the empire stopped paying salaries due to economic problems, any army, Roman or barbarian, became unreliable. Roman legions also repeatedly betrayed emperors for money or power. The appearance of the legion itself gradually changed. The classic Roman infantryman in lorica segmentata armor gave way to a Germanic-style warrior. Latin as the language of commands was mixed with barbarian dialects. By the end of the 4th century, barbarians made up a significant, if not the majority, part of the Roman army. Senior command posts were increasingly filled by commanders of Germanic origin. People such as Stilicho and Ricimer effectively ruled the empire, standing behind weak emperors. Thus, Rome fell into its own trap. It became dependent on those it despised and feared. The army, which was the mainstay of the state, ceased to be truly Roman, turning into a conglomerate of mercenary troops of dubious loyalty. The change in equipment was not so much due to the ethnicity of the soldiers as to the evolution of military tactics. Segmented armor disappeared by the 3rd century, long before the mass recruitment of barbarians, because it was expensive and difficult to manufacture. Chainmail and scale armor became the standard. Stilicho was half Vandal, but a fully Romanized commander who fiercely defended the empire. Ricimer acted later, in the middle of the 5th century, when the Western Empire was already in agony. Yes, he manipulated emperors, but so did many ethnically Roman commanders throughout history. The interpretation that Rome fell into its own trap is popular but debatable. An alternative point of view is that the barbarization of the army was not the cause, but a symptom of deeper problems: a demographic crisis, economic collapse, and political fragmentation. The Eastern Roman Empire also used barbarians, but it lasted another 1,000 years because it had a stronger economic and administrative base. The fall of the Western Roman Empire cannot be reduced to the betrayal of the barbarians in its army. It was the result of many factors, with the ethnic composition of the army being just one element in a complex mosaic. Guess what happened next? In the second half of the 4th century, the Goths appeared on the borders of the empire. They were not invaders, they were refugees fleeing the onslaught of the ferocious Huns from the east. Emperor Valens allowed them to settle in the empire's territory in Thrace, hoping to use them as soldiers and farmers. However, the Roman officials responsible for the resettlement showed incredible greed and cruelty. They took food from the Goths and humiliated them, driving them to despair. The patience of the hungry and deceived Goths ran out. The former refugees took up arms. What began as a local revolt quickly escalated into a full-scale war. Emperor Valens decided to personally lead the army and punish the rebels. He was overconfident and disregarded the advice of his more experienced commanders, who recommended waiting for reinforcements. The emperor wanted all the glory of victory to go to him alone. On August 9, 378, the Roman army approached the Gothic camp near the city of Adrianople. It was a hot day and the soldiers were exhausted from the long march. Despite this, Valens gave the order to attack immediately. The Roman legions began their advance, but their attack was disorganized. At that moment, heavy Gothic cavalry, which had previously been away on a foraging mission, attacked them from the flank. This strike was decisive. The Roman infantry, trapped on all sides, was unable to maneuver. A massacre began. The legions, which had been considered invincible for centuries, were surrounded and methodically destroyed. Most of the elite army of the Eastern Roman Empire fell in this battle. Dozens of senior officers were killed. The worst thing was that Emperor Valens himself died in battle, and his body was never found. The defeat at Adrianople came as a real shock to Rome, comparable to the darkest days of its history. For the first time in many centuries, the Roman army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of barbarians on its own territory. For the first time, the ruling emperor was killed in battle. The myth of the invincibility of the Roman legions was dispelled. It became clear that the barbarians were not just a mob of savages, but a serious military force capable of destroying the best army in the world. This catastrophe opened the gates for further invasions and marked the beginning of the end of the Western Roman Empire. This defeat shattered the myth of invincibility. But how did the empire's economy make these military disasters even worse? In the next chapter, you will learn how the financial crisis undermined Rome's power from within. Rome's fear of the barbarians grew as its own economy began to crack at the seams. The empire's wealth, which had seemed inexhaustible, began to dry up. This was due to the end of major wars of conquest. Previously, the influx of gold, slaves, and resources from conquered lands had fueled the Roman economy. When the empire shifted from expansion to defense, this source dried up. There was less and less money in the treasury. To cover the growing costs of the army and the bureaucracy, the emperors resorted to a simple but destructive method. They debased the currency by reducing the amount of precious metals in it. This led to monstrous inflation. Prices for goods rose every day. Money depreciated and people lost their savings. Trade came to a standstill, as no one wanted to accept coins that could become worthless tomorrow. To replenish the treasury, the government introduced more and more taxes. The main burden fell on small and medium-sized landowners, the foundation of Roman society. Many of them went bankrupt and abandoned their lands. These abandoned fields were bought up for next to nothing by big tycoons. They created huge estates, latifundia, which were practically independent of the central government. These estates turned into self-sufficient little worlds with their own security and their own rules. Ruined peasants either fled to the cities, swelling the ranks of the unemployed, or became dependent on the owners of the latifundia. They became colonos, semi-free tenants tied to the land. In essence, this was the beginning of a new feudal era. The state was losing taxpayers and recruits for the army. The weakened economy could no longer support the huge professional army needed to defend its vast borders. There was not enough money for salaries, weapons, and equipment. All this made the empire extremely vulnerable. While the barbarians on the borders were becoming increasingly organized, Rome was being eaten away from within by economic rust. The internal collapse was no less dangerous than the external threats. The fear of the Goths and Vandals was only a reflection of a deeper fear. It was a fear of its own powerlessness, of the state's inability to perform its basic functions. The empire was weakening from within, and the barbarians only accelerated its decline. What if I showed you a time machine and we looked into the mind of a Roman senator? He would fear not only the Germans at the border, he would fear much more the next legion marching on Rome itself. Imagine a political elite that wakes up every morning wondering, which general will declare himself emperor today? If you were a Roman senator in 238 AD, the year of the 6 emperors, you would understand that the real threat to your life and property came not from the Franks beyond the Rhine, but from the legions, which could at any moment proclaim their commander the new ruler and march on the capital. The 3rd century AD went down in history as the era of soldier emperors. It was a period of almost continuous civil war. Over half a century, several dozen rulers came and went, most of whom were proclaimed by their armies and ruled for only a few years or even months. The legions, which were supposed to defend the borders, became political tools in the hands of ambitious commanders. Instead of fighting the enemies of the empire, they fought each other. The army became the main source of instability. The crisis of the 3rd century lasted from about 235 to 284 AD. During this period, more than 50 recognized and unrecognized emperors ruled. The average length of reign was about a year. Most died violent deaths, killed by their own soldiers, rivals, or in battle. The mechanism was vicious. A legion would proclaim its commander emperor, promising him loyalty in exchange for a donative. Then this emperor had to defeat other pretenders, which required even greater payments to the army. The system turned into an auction for power. Each new emperor, upon coming to power, had to generously reward his soldiers. This depleted the treasury and forced tax increases, exacerbating the economic crisis. In essence, the empire was held hostage by its own army. Constant civil wars had disastrous consequences for the empire's defense capabilities. While the best legions were fighting each other in Italy or the Balkans, the borders on the Rhine and Danube remained unprotected. Barbarian tribes immediately took advantage of this. The economic effect was devastating. The constant devaluation of the denarius to cover military expenses led to hyperinflation. By the 260s, the silver content of the denarius had fallen to 5% of its original value. Prices rose catastrophically, trade collapsed, and cities became impoverished. Barbarian incursions became truly frequent. The Goths sacked Athens in 267. The Alemanni broke through into northern Italy. The Franks ravaged Gaul. The Persians captured and sacked Antioch in 260. Barbarian incursions into the empire became commonplace. The Franks, Goths, and Alemanni plundered entire provinces with impunity. The central government simply did not have the strength to respond adequately to all threats at once. This era of chaos undermined confidence in the very idea of the state. Citizens saw that the emperors could not ensure either internal order or external security. Loyalty shifted from distant Rome to local military leaders or large landowners who could offer at least some protection. Political instability led to the deterioration of governance. Experienced officials were replaced by the appointees of the latest temporary ruler. Long-term planning became impossible. The process of feudalization began at that very moment. Large landowners created private armies to protect their estates. Colony tenant farmers became increasingly dependent on their patrons, laying the foundations for medieval serfdom. Central power weakened while local power grew stronger. As a result, the empire became a colossus with feet of clay. Outwardly, it still looked powerful, but its internal structures were corroded by civil wars. Rome feared its own generals more than it feared barbarian chieftains. Internal chaos left the borders weak. But who was the greatest terror that came from the east to take advantage of this weakness? The crisis of the 3rd century was overcome thanks to a series of strong reformist emperors: Aurelian, Probus, Diocletian. They restored the borders, reformed the army and administration, and stabilized the economy. However, structural problems, dependence on the army, economic weakness, and barbarian pressure remained and ultimately led to the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century. At the end of the 4th century, a wave of terror swept across the European steppes. A nomadic people came from the east, unlike any the Romans or Goths had known before. The name of this people was the Huns. The origin of the Huns is still a matter of debate, but their appearance had the effect of a bomb going off. They were unmatched horsemen and archers. Their tactics of warfare were completely foreign to the European peoples. The core of their army was light cavalry. A Hun warrior was born and died in the saddle. They could cover huge distances at incredible speeds, appearing where they were least expected. Their main weapon was a powerful composite bow. The Huns could shoot accurately at full gallop, showering their enemies with a cloud of arrows. This hit-and-run tactic exhausted and demoralized even the most resilient infantry. They did not seek to conquer territories in the classical sense. Their goal was to plunder, loot, and subjugate other tribes. They created a vast nomadic empire, forcing conquered peoples to pay tribute and fight in their army. It was the pressure of the Huns to the east that forced the Goths and other tribes to move west and seek refuge within the Roman Empire. Thus, without even coming into direct contact with Rome, the Huns provoked a crisis that led to the Battle of Adrianople. They set off a chain reaction known as the Great Migration. The appearance and customs of the Huns inspired superstitious horror. Roman historians describe them as people who were more like animals than humans. These descriptions were certainly exaggerated, but they reflected the shock that the ancient world experienced when encountering a completely different culture. The Huns did not build cities or engage in agriculture. Their entire lives were spent on the move. This made them an elusive enemy. They had no rear or supply centers that could be attacked. Their appearance completely changed the balance of power in Europe. They were the catalyst that destroyed the old order and accelerated the fall of Rome. But the real peak of Hun power and Roman fear was associated with the name of one man. That man was their most famous leader, whose name became synonymous with destruction. He was known as the Scourge of God, and his name was Attila. In the middle of the 5th century, a leader whose name struck terror throughout Europe rose to power at the head of the Hunnic Empire, Attila. He was not only a talented military leader, but also a brilliant politician who managed to unite dozens of diverse tribes under his rule. His empire stretched from the Caucasus to the Rhine. Attila understood the psychology of his enemies perfectly. He used terror as a tool of state policy. Rumors of his cruelty preceded his army, paralyzing the will to resist. He waged war simultaneously against both parts of the Roman Empire, Western and Eastern. Attila did not seek to conquer Rome. His goal was subjugation and tribute. He viewed the empire as a cash cow that was supposed to provide him with gold. The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, paid him off with huge annual payments. Gold flowed like a river to Attila's court, allowing him to keep his chiefs in line and hire new troops. He literally brought Constantinople to its knees without storming its walls. Attila then turned his attention to the west. In 451, he invaded Gaul with a huge army consisting of Huns, Goths, Gepids, and many other tribes. He was met by a united army of Romans and their former enemies, the Visigoths. One of the greatest battles of antiquity took place, the Battle of the Catalonian Fields. It was an incredibly bloody battle in which both sides suffered enormous losses. Although formally the battle ended in a draw, Attila was forced to retreat from Gaul. This battle showed that the scourge of God could be stopped. But in the following year, 452, he struck at the very heart of the Western Empire, Italy. He ravaged many cities, including Aquileia, Padua, and Milan. The way to Rome was open. Panic gripped the city. However, Attila unexpectedly turned back before reaching the Eternal City. The reasons for this decision remain unclear. Perhaps an epidemic broke out in his army, or he feared a Byzantine attack on his rear. According to legend, Pope Leo I, who came out to meet him with a delegation, convinced him to stop. Shortly after this campaign, Attila died. His death led to the immediate collapse of his empire. The conquered tribes rebelled, and the Hunnic threat disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Despite this, Attila's reign was one of the most terrifying periods for Rome. It showed how vulnerable the empire had become. The fear of the Huns was so great that Attila's name became a symbol of barbarian destruction for centuries to come. The threat from the Huns had passed, but the empire was mortally wounded. Its provinces fell one after another, captured by various barbarian tribes. One of the most successful was the tribe of the Vandals. Unlike many others, the Vandals created their own powerful kingdom. Led by the cunning and cruel King Gaiseric, they captured the richest province of the Western Empire, North Africa. This was a crushing blow to Rome. Africa was the empire's main breadbasket. The loss of grain supplies from Carthage doomed the population of Rome to starvation. The empire lost not only food, but also huge tax revenues. Moreover, the Vandals, who were a land-based people, quickly mastered seafaring. They created a powerful fleet and became the masters of the Western Mediterranean. Their pirate raids paralyzed maritime trade. In 450-5, taking advantage of another period of turmoil in Rome, Gaiseric landed at the mouth of the Tiber and approached the Eternal City. Unlike in Attila's time, Rome no longer had an army or strong allies to defend it. The city was doomed. Pope Leo I again entered into negotiations. This time, he was unable to prevent the looting, but he managed to persuade Gaiseric to refrain from arson and mass murder. The Vandals were given 2 weeks to methodically and systematically plunder the city. It was not a chaotic rampage, but a systematic removal of all valuables. The palaces of emperors and aristocrats were emptied. All the gold, silver, bronze statues, and even the gilded tiles from the roof of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus were taken from the city. The Vandals took thousands of prisoners with them, including the empress and her daughters. This second sacking of Rome in its history, after the Gallic one, became the ultimate symbol of its decline. It showed the whole world that the former capital of the world was defenseless. The event of 455 was not so much a military defeat as a moral catastrophe. It demonstrated the complete impotence of imperial power. Rome ceased to be a center of power and became a ghost of its former self. Since then, the word vandalism has become a household name, although in reality the looting was organized and not senselessly destructive. But for contemporaries, that did not matter. All that mattered was that the Eternal City had been humiliated once again. After the sacking by the Vandals, the Western Roman Empire existed only in name. Real power belonged not to faceless emperors, but to their barbarian commanders. These men, who bore the title of Masters of the Army, installed and deposed puppet rulers at their discretion. Imagine a state where the emperor is just a title without power, where real decisions are made by military leaders who do not even pretend to respect their nominal rulers. If you were a Roman aristocrat in the 470s, you would understand that you were living in a theater of shadows, where all the roles had long been cast and the ending was a foregone conclusion. Imperial power had completely lost its authority. The territory it controlled had shrunk to Italy alone. Gaul, Spain, Africa, all these former provinces had become independent barbarian kingdoms. In 476, the last change of power took place. The commander of the barbarian mercenaries in Italy, the Germanic Odoacer, demanded land for his people. When his demands were rejected, he easily overthrew the last Western Roman emperor. Ironically, the last emperor was named Romulus Augustulus. His name combined the names of the founder of Rome and the founder of the empire. But he himself was only a young man with no real power. Clarification: Augustulus is a diminutive form meaning Little Augustus, a mocking nickname. His real name was Romulus Augustus. He was about 16 years old when his father, Orestes, himself a former secretary of Attila, proclaimed him emperor in 475. He ruled for less than a year. Odoacer's demand was typical for the time. The barbarian federates wanted to receive a third of the lands of Italy for settlement. When Orestes refused, Odoacer rebelled, killed Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus, but spared his life, sending him into exile with a pension. Odoacer did not appoint a new emperor. He sent the imperial regalia, the diadem, scepter, and purple mantle, to Constantinople. With this gesture, he showed that the emperor was no longer needed in the West. To his contemporaries, this event did not seem out of the ordinary. It was just another change of power in a series of endless coups. No one thought they were witnessing the end of an entire era. Odoacer recognized the formal authority of the Eastern Emperor Zeno, declaring himself his viceroy in Italy with the title Rex, King. It was a diplomatic maneuver that created the appearance of continuity. The Eastern Empire formally accepted this, although it had no real control. Contemporaries did not really realize the epical significance of this event. Many Roman institutions continued to function. The Senate sat, Roman law was applied, and Latin remained the language of administration. The transition was gradual. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not a dramatic event. It was a long and painful process of decline. The year 476 is only a conventional date chosen by historians for convenience. The empire did not fall under the blows of the barbarians. The barbarians merely finished off an already dying organism. The real reasons lay within: economic crises, political instability, civil wars, and the degradation of the army. Fear of the barbarians was only a symptom of a deep internal disease. Rome fell because it ceased to be Rome. Its institutions weakened, its values eroded, and its citizens lost the will to defend their world. This interpretation has been popular since the time of Edward Gibbon, but it simplifies a complex reality. Yes, internal problems were critical, but external pressure was also real and unprecedented. The Hun invasion triggered a chain reaction of migrations. The Persian threat in the east diverted resources. The phrase Rome fell because it ceased to be Rome sounds profound, but what does it mean specifically? Roman identity evolved over centuries. The Rome of the 3rd century BC was radically different from the Rome of the 3rd century AD. Constant change was the norm, not decline. The barbarians simply filled a void. They did not so much destroy Rome as build a new world on its ruins, the world of the Middle Ages. And the fear that Rome felt toward them was actually a fear of its own reflection in the mirror of history. This is a poetic metaphor, but not historically accurate. The barbarians did not simply fill a void, they actively transformed society. Barbarian kingdoms were hybrids of Roman and Germanic institutions, creating something new. Fear of one's own reflection is a beautiful phrase, but what does it mean literally? If the idea is that the Romans feared their own weakness reflected in the barbarian threat, it is an interesting thought, but it remains a metaphor rather than an explanation. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was the result of many intertwined factors: demographic, economic, military, political, climatic, and epidemiological. To reduce it to a single cause, internal or external, is to oversimplify history. We can see that Rome's fear of the barbarians was a complex and multifaceted phenomenon. It arose from memories of past humiliations, from the shock of crushing defeats, and from terror of previously unseen enemies. But its main cause was the growing weakness of the empire itself. Rome fell not because the barbarians were invincible, but because its own political, economic, and military systems had fallen into decline. Internal conflicts and civil wars weakened it more than any army from outside. The barbarians were not so much the cause as the catalyst and consequence of this decline. The story of Rome's fall is a timeless reminder that the greatest threat to any great power often lies not beyond its borders, but within. It is a lesson in how arrogance, corruption, and a loss of internal unity can destroy even the most powerful civilization. What do you think about these events? Which of the reasons for the fall of Rome do you think is the main one? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe.